And at this time, I would like to introduce your host for the evening, the commander of Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall, Colonel Michael Henderson.
Thanks, Lee. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for coming. But General and Mrs. Risch, General and Mrs. Wilson, community, installation partners, distinguished guests, good evening. On behalf of Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall and my Command Sergeant Major Randy Woods, I take great pleasure in welcoming all of you to historic Fort McNair and to the equally historic Fort McNair Officers Club, and to this special evening as we observe the 150-year anniversary of the start of the military tribunal of those who conspired to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. We are also honored to have with us tonight several authors, historians, and subject matter experts on the topics of the Lincoln assassination and military tribunal, as well as some direct descendants of those involved with that historic event in our nation's history. Welcome all. And I would like to extend a special thanks to the members of the U.S. Army Band String Quartet who provided the wonderful music during our reception. Let's give those folks a hand. Today is historically significant, as the 9-member military commission first met on this date, May 8th, 1865, and of course the military tribunal began the next day on May 9th. This observance will give us all the opportunity to learn in more detail about and reflect on what happened here 150 years ago. We have an excellent program lined up for you tonight. You will hear from 4 distinguished authors and subject matter experts who will answer many of the questions we all have about what happened and over the 2 months of the trial and the execution that followed. And following their remarks, we'll walk over to Grant Hall to have a look inside the courtroom where the trial took place and visit the execution site. And I hope everyone has a great evening. So to begin our program, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's first speaker, historian and author Michael Kauffman.
Well, thank you so much. As I look up at the screen, it reminded me that whenever I'm invited to speak somewhere, they always say, "Can I get you anything, PowerPoint, anything?" There's one condition that lately has been creeping into my demands, my list of demands. One of them, if you look at this, please do not bring this up to me and say, "Oh my God, when was that picture taken?" We'll all get there sooner or later, you know. I can't believe what we're doing. This is so nice, so wonderful that we are now celebrating the restoration of this courtroom. This is such a valuable and important part of American history, American legal history, Civil War history. I don't think it has really been acknowledged or noticed quite as much as it ought to have been. And I'm so surprised that the restoration was undertaken, and just delighted at the job they've done with it. The reason I think the Lincoln conspiracy trial is so important and should be better known to all people is that it was a military trial of civilians at a time when those things had been sort of commonplace. Most people don't realize that. And when I started to study the trial back in the 1970s, people tended to say, well, what difference does it make for us now? Why do we care now? Because we're never going to have military trials of civilians again. The academic type said, don't waste your time, just go out and study constitutional law, because that touches upon this. Oh, no, okay, it does, sure. But after 9/11, people started calling me and saying, hey, what do you know about this? And amazingly, I found something about this trial that was a little bit, I hate to say uplifting, but it was kind of a positive note. They didn't use this as a precedent. During the American Civil War, military necessity, and let's face it, you can't really say there was no necessity to take extreme measures during the American Civil War. At the very beginning, the first week of the war, Abraham Lincoln, the new president, has learned the hard way that Washington is really surrounded by people who are not terribly friendly to the Union and to his administration. On one side, you've got Virginia, and out the window, Lincoln can see that. Enemy territory, or it would soon be. The other three sides of Washington, well, that's Maryland. And most people don't stop to think about what was going on in Maryland. It was below the Mason-Dixon line, sure, but it stayed in the Union. And that's all anybody really needs to know, right? Not really. Because Abraham Lincoln came through Maryland on the way to become President of the United States in February of 1861. And there were rumors that somebody was going to kill him on the way through Baltimore. It was perfectly believable, and as I found out very much to my surprise, when James Buchanan came through through Baltimore on his way to become president, they beat him up. And Buchanan was kind of inoffensive at the time, you know. So when Lincoln comes through, the idea that somebody would try to kill him was quite believable, and of course he had to take precautions. He took an earlier train, he came through Washington in the middle of the night, and it made him look foolish. And he got a very valuable lesson from that. He learned that Baltimore is going to come back and bite you sooner or later. And so he declared martial law first along what is now called the I-95 corridor and then all over the state of Maryland, because a week after the war began in April of 1861, troops came through, first from Pennsylvania, the following day from Massachusetts. They came through Baltimore on the way to Washington to answer Lincoln's call, and they were set upon by a mob. And there was loss of life, and Lincoln figured, well, if we can't get our troops down here to fight the war, then how are we going to have any chance of winning it? Thus, the declaration of martial law. And what did that mean? It just meant that as an emergency measure, you can arrest someone. There's no writ of habeas corpus. You don't have to bring that person into a court before a judge and tell exactly why he has been arrested. That has been suspended. And throughout the war, that same rule by executive action was in effect. By the time the Lincoln assassination came along 4 years later, almost to the day, there was no longer any question that they could do this, because in 1863, the Supreme Court, probably intending a slap at the president, had said, when one of these cases came up on appeal, they said, oh, we don't take appeals from those things. We only take appeals from real courts. But what that meant was anybody accused in one of these trials, military trials of civilians, whatever that tribunal decided was final unless the president said otherwise. You could go to the president for a pardon, but you could not go to the Supreme Court or any appellate court for any kind of legal relief. So there was no question on April 15th, 1865, as Abraham Lincoln had just died in Washington, There was no question the way this trial was going to go. It was going to become a military tribunal. And because it had happened, the assassination had happened exactly when it did, it was hugely controversial. Robert E. Lee had surrendered his troops, and that's not all of Confederate troops, but the troops under his command had been surrendered the previous week on April 9th. On April 13th, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, talking with General Grant, who had just come into Washington that day, had done this quick, sudden, decisive drawdown, stop recruiting, stop buying supplies for the Army, stop the draft, all of that stuff immediately, and no longer require any pass to go to